Hello, everyone. Welcome to AIPAD Talks. My name is Andra Russick from Scheinbaum and Russick Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I am the chair of the AIPAD Education Committee, member of AIPAD, and the presenter of this AIPAD Talk. As many of you know, AIPAD is dedicated to creating and maintaining high standards in the business of exhibiting, buying, and selling photographic art. With that in mind, we are very thrilled that the photography show will return again to the Park Avenue Armory in April. Those dates are April 23rd to April 27th. We hope that all of you will join us in New York. It's going to be a great show, and we're looking forward to seeing as many of you as we can in person there. As part of our education program, we're pleased to present AIPAD Talks. It is a series that we do continuously through the year, where we have speakers from various institutions and galleries and artists talk about their work. Today's talk will be hearing from Malcolm Daniel. Malcolm is the Gus and Lyndall Wortham Curator of Photography at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. He assumed that position in December of 2013 after 23 years on the curatorial staff at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including 9 years as the head of the museum's Department of Photographs. Malcolm received his BA in Art History and Studio Art from Trinity College and his master's and PhD in Art History from Princeton University. At the Metropolitan and MFAH, he has curated countless exhibitions and installations and authored many exhibition catalogs and articles. He has lectured extensively throughout his career. He has also served as adjunct faculty at Columbia University and NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. He is the co-curator of the exhibition Navigating the Waves, Contemporary Cuban Photography, and a co-author of the catalog. Today, Malcolm's going to be talking about the exhibition, and I just want to let you all know that this talk will be recorded. It will be available on the AIPAD website. And what I'd like to also let you know is that at the end of the talk, we're going to do a Q&A. You can put your questions into the Q&A. I will read them for Malcolm, and he will then be able to respond to them. So please put your questions in. If you put them in during the talk, that's fine, but they won't be answered till the end. Also, in the chat, I'm going to put a link to the museum exhibition and a link to purchase the exhibition catalog, which Malcolm is a co-author of. So with all of that being said, I want to introduce Malcolm and hand it over to him so we can all hear what he has to say about this amazing exhibition. Malcolm, please.
Thanks, Andra, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. Always happy to sort of spread the word about what we're doing in Houston. And yeah, welcome everybody to Houston or to Cuba today. I don't know which. The exhibition Navigating the Waves is in our still new Nancy and Rich Kinder building. It's a Stephen Hall designed gallery building that we opened in the midst of the pandemic in November of 2020. And it has galleries, permanently dedicated galleries for photography, and then also galleries where our department and others, modern art, design, prints and drawings, Latin American art, all come together in dialogue. So it's been a great addition to the museum's campus, and I encourage everybody to come here. The exhibition that I'll be speaking about is drawn entirely from our permanent collection, and it's on view through August 3rd of this year, so it's a long run. I need to, advance my slide. There we go. The exhibition celebrates the acquisition of about 300 photographs from the Madeleine P. Plonsker Collection. Madeleine is a Chicago-based collector who traveled to Cuba frequently, befriended many of the artists that I'll introduce you to today, and formed a really extraordinary collection of contemporary Cuban photography. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the exhibition came together, a little bit of behind the scenes. So it actually has an AIPAD connection. In 2017, this museum hosted a major exhibition called Adios Utopia, which included photography, but was not limited to photography. It was about contemporary Cuban art. And at the same time that that major exhibition was going on, our department did a small installation of Cuban photographs from our collection. We didn't have a deep collection, but it made sense to do it at the same time as Adios Utopia was up. And by coincidence, when we came that spring to New York for AIPAD, it was the first year that AIPAD was on the piers. We're all happy it's back in the Armory. But one of the things at the piers was there was a huge amount of space, more space than the fair actually needed. And so they took the opportunity to invite a number of private collectors to show portions of their collection. And one of those collectors was Madeleine Plonsker. You see on the right in her booth at AIPAD that spring. And so when we saw that, we thought like, oh, wow, we should get this person to talk to our patron group. We were there with people from our patron group, Photo Forum, doing a visit to New York and obviously a tour of the show. And so we tracked down Madeleine and asked if she would speak to our group, and she did so enthusiastically. And at the end, we said, well, you got to come to Houston and see what we've got. And so she visited later that year. And what she found was a collection of about 100 Cuban photographs, mostly from the 1960s into the 1990s. My predecessor, Ann Tucker, had acquired work from some of the photographers who were invited to Houston in 1994 by PhotoFest. PhotoFest is an institution I hope all of you know. There's a major sort of biennial exhibition every 2 years, obviously. But they have exhibitions throughout the year also. And Wendy Watrous and Fred Baldwin, co-founders of PhotoFest, had spent time in Cuba, had worked with people at Phototeca to identify exciting young photographers who were doing work that was not well known in the United States at all. So they invited 15 photographers to Houston, each showing about 10 works. It was called the New Generation Contemporary Cuban Photography. And Ann Tucker bought work from some of those photographers. And I have to say that we still consider most of the photographers who were in that show to be major figures. I don't know, I think it's a combination of the wisdom of Fred and Wendy's choices, and also the career transforming effect of having been included in that show in the States for many of those photographers. It gave them a great new status back at home. So when Madeleine came, she found that there was a kind of synergy between her collection and our collection, that hers picked up right where ours left off. She went to Cuba first in I think 2002. Our collection had work sort of up into the 90s, and then she began collecting in 2002, but including work that had been made later in the 90s. They came together beautifully. Some of the same artists were in both collections, but there was only like 1 or 2 pictures that were literally duplicates. And so having discovered that perfect synergy between the 2 collections, the idea of an acquisition and exhibition and catalog was hatched. And Madeleine and her husband, Harvey, made the decision to donate their collection to our museum. Now, I have to say, this was not an area that I had any real expertise in. What I did know about, all I knew about Cuban photography was that if you took Madeleine's collection and our collection and you put them together, it would make something important. So The first thing I did was to head to Havana with Madeleine in January of 2020, just prior to pandemic. I went again in 2022 when travel became possible again. On that first trip, Madeleine put me in the hands of a young curator named Raquel Carrera, who you see sitting on the sofa with Rene Pena in the sort of third picture in the top. Raquel had worked with Madeleine over the years and also had been a curator of other works around the world, really, in Peru and China and various places. And she knew, not only knew Madeleine, but knew many of the photographers. And on that first trip, she served as my guide and my translator and organizer. And we had about 15 or 16 studio visits and interviews with artists in the collection. And you'll meet some of these people, you'll see some of these people's work as we go along. And sort of going from the top, it's Juan Carlos Alom, Cyrenaica Marrera, Rene Pena with Raquel, Pedro Abascal holding the print of Corda's famous picture of Che Guevara, the actual print that's in our show we bought from Pedro. And then at the bottom, Adrian Fernandez, Lisette Solorzano, and there's Madeleine enjoying a good Cuban cigar during our trip. I did not partake. And just to give you a sense of how things develop, of course, the pictures that Ann Tucker had bought served as a magnet for Madeleine's collection. And that served as a magnet to further enhance our collection. One of Raquel's tasks for the catalog was to clear copyright. And so she was in touch with various artists in the States and spoke to a woman named Alba Borrego in Miami, who was the widow of Ivan Cañas. We had some pictures by Cañas in the collection. They were in the show and we needed the copyright. And Alba really doesn't like to do email and work on the computer. So Raquel started having phone conversations with her and developed a kind of friendship. And Alba let her know that the Reina Sofia had wanted to acquire the whole collection of her husband's work that she had. She thought it was maybe 200 or 300 pictures, but they wanted her to do all the cataloging on the computer before they would accept it, even as a gift. It was just too much for her to do. And she said to Raquel, if Raquel would come to Miami and work with her, would our museum be interested in those pictures? And I said to Raquel, get on a plane. She went the next week, spent a week working with Alba. It turned out there were 2,000 photographs, from which Raquel selected about 300 that made sense for our collection in terms of condition and content. And we got another one or two of those in the show, but it means that our collection in the course of this project grew from 100 photographs to 400 photographs to 700 photographs, representing the nice, the sort of full sweep from the time of the revolution to the present. Ivan Cañas's pictures are mostly from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and included not only his work, but other photographers working in Cuba during those years. So on to the exhibition. It's on the third floor of our of our new building, as I mentioned, and it's organized in 4 sections. It's not an illustrated history of Cuba. It's not even a chronological display of the development of Cuban photography. It's really there is a certain chronology to it, but the pictures are arranged thematically. There's a prologue and then 3 major sections, and I'll take you through that. And we begin with pictures that were made right after the revolution. And just to review, it was January 1st of 1959 when Castro's revolutionary forces overthrew the dictator Fulgencio Batista. And those new leaders, Castro and Che Guevara and others, had a radical agenda to communicate to the population that was largely illiterate and largely Catholic. And so imagery seemed to be the way to communicate. If you think about Catholicism, you think about the importance of imagery, crucifix or the Stations of the Cross. People were used to understanding stories from pictorial records. And so they enlisted the support of the major photographers of the period. The most, the guru of fashion photography in Havana before the revolution was Alberto Korda. So they got Korda. Korda became Castro's favorite photographer. And there were others also. And they gave this little circle of photographers extraordinary access to circles of power, always able to be, in the room or on the stage when the leaders were speaking. And these photographers, who we have come to refer to as the epic generation photographers, the epic photographers, they, in a way, created the iconography of the revolution. There's no Cuban picture that's more famous than this one of Che Guevara, taken in 1960. You usually see it in a cropped version that just shows his head. It seemed impossible to have the show and not include that. But I have to say that this prologue with the picture of Che and what I'll show you next, in a way, this is there to show you what the rest of the exhibition is not about. The rest of the exhibition is really not about photography in service to the state. But that's where the story begins. This picture stayed in Korda's files for about 7 years, mostly unused, until Che's capture and death in Bolivia. He was trying to organize a popular revolution there, was captured and assassinated. And then he became lionized in Cuba as a kind of exemplar of revolutionary self-sacrifice, almost like the image of a martyred saint. So, another image by the sort of epic photographer from the epic generation is Raul Corrales's cavalry picture. And it's often described as Castro's forces engaged in the nationalization and expropriation of a plantation that's owned by United Fruit Company. But in fact, that's not what it is. Raquel likes to joke. She said, we're behind the times a little bit in Cuba, but in 1960, we had cars. We weren't all riding horses. When you look at it, you'll see that they're riding horses. They all have matching straw hats. They got sunglasses and all. What they're doing is reenacting a famous battle from the War for Independence from Spain in the late 19th century. They're celebrating the nationalization of the United Fruit Company plantation, but they're doing so by connecting their movement to the long struggle for independence going back to the 19th century. And of course, this also probably reminds you of heroic history painting from the 19th century even. And that's not accidental. Now, there are a couple other photographers of that same generation, or maybe a little bit younger. So Ivan Cañas, who I mentioned, is one. Pedro Benavides, another, who also were celebrating heroes of Cuban independence, but in a different way. And so Cañas, for instance, is showing veterans, but not veterans of the war that just happened, the revolution, but veterans of the 19th century struggle for independence. And you'll see that it's a very different image where Che Guevara, Fidel Castro are always shown in a kind of heroic, virile, masculine way. Here, there's a sense of modesty. There's a sense of humility, of vulnerability in the pictures of the veterans that Cañas made. Or for Benavides, his his series was of centenarians. It was taken in 1981. All of the people that he photographed were Afro-Cuban. And being at least 100 years old, that meant that they were born into slavery in Cuba, because slavery was not abolished until 1886 in Cuba. So there's a celebration of people who have made the country what it is in this new era, but also an acknowledgement of history there. There's a transitional figure too, a kind of link between generations, Jose Figueroa. Figueroa was too young to participate in the revolution, but shortly thereafter, at the age of 17, he started working for Alberto Corda's studio. And among his tasks over the years was to print thousands, literally thousands, he told us, of prints of the famous image of Che Guevara. And this was taken one evening as he was waiting for prints to dry. They were spread out on his bed. He was waiting for them to dry so he could go to sleep. And it made him think about the way that photography had changed from being, servant of the socialist state there to something that had also become a kind of commodity. And it's the beginning of looking at photography with a sense of social critique as part of the story. And then we begin, so that's the kind of prologue. And then we begin 3 sections, the first of which we call Picturing Life, Joys and Hardships in Post-Revolution Cuba. And I think to give you a little bit of background, I mean, most of the rest of the pictures in the show are from the period, say 1990 forward. Just to give you the historical context, in the 1970s, Cuba became increasingly dependent politically and economically on the Soviet Union. Huge economic subsidies kept the country going. And with that Sovietization came a kind of Sovietization of cultural policy also. And that meant that if you didn't toe the line, if you ran afoul of the censors, you might not be able to publish your work. You might not be able to show your artwork. You might lose your professorship. So people had to be careful about what they said, what subjects they treated. So for some people, some people sort of stayed away from directly addressing social and political issues. Some people went back to other parts outside of Havana where they had grown up. Raul Cañabano, for instance, who I think is a great photographer. He's on Instagram. I see his work all the time, and they're just many, many wonderful pictures that he takes. He grew up in the eastern part of the country, and in 1998, he went back to that area to develop this series called Country Land, linked to his childhood memories. Rural life and labor remained little changed really from the time when he grew up. Or Pedro Abascal on the right, again, photographing rural life and labor. And I think in both of these, I think both are terrific pictures. And I think in both cases, you can sense that photographers are beginning to become familiar with the kind of street photography and documentation that they're seeing from the US and from Europe, mostly through books, of course. Some people turned inward to family. One example is Alfredo Sarabia. He had worked for various publications in Cuba, but in the last years of his life, he died quite young at in 1992. In the last couple of years, he really focused on photographing his family. And on the picture on the left, you see his young son, also named Alfredo, climbing into the window of the Volkswagen, their Volkswagen Beetle. There are other pictures of Alfredo also. It's sort of the life of a child. Well, young Alfredo has also become a photographer. His dad died when he was 6, when young Alfredo was 6. And so Alfredo now has the same 1972 Volkswagen Beetle, and it's the kind of playground for his own 4 kids. They take family trips to the beach or to the countryside in that same car in the way that he did when he was a kid. And photography became a way of linking to his father. I think he used his father's camera at the start. And there's something just incredibly sweet about that connection. And I love the pictures that young Alfredo has made. Thinking of joys of post-revolution Cuba, there's not a whole lot of entertainment for teenagers in Havana, but one thing that they like to do is when there are torrential rains, they go surfing. And by surfing, it means putting on a pair of old shoes and grabbing onto the back of a bus or car and surfing down the avenue in the Buena Vista neighborhood. This actually was a project that came from a request from the Huntington Beach Art Center in California, sent out a call for pictures of surfing from around the world. And what they got from Cuba was quite different than the standard, blonde surfer dude, blonde, white, wealthy. It was a different thing, but equally joyful. For photographers who did want to address social and political issues, they had to do it really through metaphor. There's always an awareness of the government censors looking. Eduardo Munoz Ordoqui photographed at the Havana Zoo. Now, the Havana Zoo, when it was built, was like most zoos, a place for entertainment and leisure. It was beautiful, but in the 1990s, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, in the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, all that economic subsidy for Cuba disappeared, and it was hard times. There was rationing of food, of gasoline. It was a period of great deprivation that Fidel Castro euphemistically called a special period in a time of peace. So Ordoqui photographed at the zoo because if times were hard for people, they were hard also for the animals. And one of his university classmates, Juan Antonio Molina, in talking about this series of photographs, remembered having seen an emaciated lion at another zoo. And he said of the lion, he was reduced to the sad condition of a hungry dog, kept within a space that became more and more limited, more and more oppressive. Of course, that was a metaphor for how the Cuban people felt at that very moment. And Eduardo Munoz Ordoqui immigrated that same year, 1992, first to Mexico and now to the US. He lives in Austin. Everybody knows that in Havana, there are all these old cars that have been kept running, cars in the 1950s, by just sheer necessity. And people use sort of loving care and chewing gum and gaffer's tape to keep things going. And so there's something very funny about this picture, I think. It may be that Mario Diaz took it because it just seemed humorous to him. But there's also this idea of a man literally swallowed up by an aging car that he tries to keep running despite limited resources. You might understand that as emblematic of the whole country itself in the special period of the 1990s. But maybe he just took it because it was funny. The second thematic section, is called Turning Inward: Memory, the Body, and Identity. So as that Soviet support disappeared and the country was plunged into a period of real hardship, there was sort of paradoxically a loosening of certain social controls. So for instance, sorry, we don't have food for you, but you want religion? You can have religion back. So there was a kind of loosening of what was permitted. And one thing that happens in this period is that whereas most of the photography that came earlier was made out in the world, documentary in one way or another, perhaps street photography, there's a turning inward. There's a lot of work in the studio and work that's more conceptual in the 1990s. So on the left, work by Antonio Gomez Margolles. This is an image he found at the home of a friend who had inherited a house sometime earlier. And in the house, that friend kept one room that she rarely entered, and it was full of objects from the past, including like this photograph of a couple, perhaps distant relatives, but she didn't know. So there's something poignant for Margolles about trying to preserve the past, a certain memory, but the way it fades and the knowledge fades. Similarly, on the right, a work by Jose Manuel Force. He made a series called Bundles of Memories, where he bound up together family pictures, newspaper clippings, letters, things like that. Think about the way that people used to sort of tie love letters, bundle of love letters with a pink ribbon or something like that. So preserving those family memories. At the same time, there's something contradictory there because it hides the work. It preserves them, but it hides them. And if you open it up, you destroy the work at the same time that you get to see what's in there. Juan Carlos Alom was interested in sort of mining the folk traditions of Cuba, particularly Afro-Cuban folk religious rituals. Think of Santeria, for instance, and using photography in a more poetic way. And part of that was that he was forced to, because the materials were so scarce, that in order to practice photography, he had to use, strands of film that were left over from the cinema, from the Filmmaking Institute. You get the ends of the reel of film, chemistry that he bought on the black market from the X-ray lab at the hospital, expired Chinese paper. And so sometimes there were flaws that he just went with. It encouraged him to have a sense of experimentation and to build on that for a sense of poetry in his work. René Peña, this is a pretty interesting picture. It's the beginning of a series. It's what led to a series that he called White Things. And in each case, it's something white. Might be a cigarette, it might be white briefs, things that are sort of superficial against his black body. The black body sort of disappears there. And you have to realize that with the Cuban Revolution, the government declared that racism was ended. That racism had been eradicated, problem solved. But of course, you can't just declare it like that. And racism continues. But if you bring that up as a subject, that is challenging the accomplishments, the achievements of the revolution. So you couldn't really address that directly. So what he did was to show these sort of superficial things in the foreground, his Black body disappearing into the background, like the concerns that he felt about race. Two female artists whose careers changed really from performance to photography and studio photography, with motherhood in each case. And Marta Maria Perez Bravo was also interested in sort of ritual and reshaping folk traditions into a kind of personal ritual. So in Mexican and Caribbean Catholicism, there's a popular devotional image called the all-powerful hand of God. And the five fingers are representing the saints Joachim and Joseph, the Virgin Mary, and Jesus. And so she changed the all-powerful hand of God to the all-powerful hand of the artist, seeking to dominate the various powers in the art world. And each of her five gallerists is represented by one of the little almost like voodoo dolls that are there. Cyrenaica Morera also uses her body and constructs pictures, melding different images to talk about her body and questioning the shifting values of Havana in the 1990s. Her title, the title of the series, Metallica, refers to the sort of slang word that you use for cash, metal, like change. Eduardo Hernandez Santos was trained in a very classical way, drawing and engraving, and then discovered the expressiveness of photography as he was also discovering his own sexuality. And he was the first photographer to have to present an exhibition of male nudes at Fototeca, the National Photo Center, in the early 2000s. I forget the exact year. But he's presenting a different image of masculinity than the epic photographer. So not that kind of heroic, virile hero of the revolution like Che, but somebody more vulnerable. Here, there's a kind of literal fishhook that's a physical object on the photograph, sort of pulling the figure. Alejandro Gonzalez, back out in the street now, sort of no longer in the studio, but out in the street in 2008. It was the second annual Day Against Homophobia. And he began a series called Improper Behavior, where he carried his camera with him, and he just got so close to people that they had individual identity, but you could no longer, they were devoid of anything that you could be judgmental about. You couldn't judge their body type, their style, their fashion, their economic status. Even their gender was hard to pin down on some of the pictures. Again, sort of back out into the world. In the 2000s, Alejandro Perez Alvarez, he met a drag queen one day, and through that person was introduced to the dynamics of Cuban drag scene. This was a club outside of Paris in the provinces called El Bohemio that occasionally hosted drag shows. He's sort of in the back there. And Ariane Chang was interested in photographing the body, but not in the sort of tired genre of the nude. and sort of introduced himself into the bodybuilding community. He never lifted weights himself, but he gained the confidence of people enough to just hang out and photograph at the gym. The last section, and I'll try to wrap up pretty quickly. The last section has to do with questioning the revolution. So these are photographers. All of the pictures in this section are, I think without exception, made in the 21st century. And they're photographers who are younger, so they may have been children during this special period, may be conscious of that. They certainly were born well after the glory days of the revolution. But they came of age artistically in the new century with a greater awareness of what was going on globally in the art world, with beginning access to the internet and with new materials, such. And there's a kind of questioning of their country's history. Asterio Segura's series is called The Secret. And, the US has had something sort of like Radio Free Europe called Radio Marti and Telemarti, which we tried to beam US news to Cuba. And of course, the government would then jam the signal. But people were very clever about getting communication from the US. What they wanted was not telemarti. They wanted to see the cartoons and the sitcoms and the regular news programs and things like that. And so people would clandestinely set up satellite dishes, but you had to hide it. So this is a satellite dish just covered with a garbage bag, but able to bring that signal in. That sense of news and communication, that is something that is so controlling of what we believe. We're aware of that in our own lives now. It's also addressed by Alejandro Gonzalez. This one called the 9th of November, 1989. I don't know if anybody remembers that date, but that's the date that the Berlin Wall fell. And that's what you see on the television here. But the picture is made in 2012, and it's not documentary. It's all set up. The location was scouted. The figure in the doorway was hired as an actor. The television feed was superimposed there. And the point is that even though the wall came down in November 1989, that was never broadcast in Cuba. So he's reconstructed that history, the history that never really happened. And I want to end with a series of pictures about patriotic symbols. So you'll remember in the early part of my talk, you'll remember this picture with the Cuban flags waving, right? And that was a common thing. Jose Figueroa did a whole series called That Flag. Here you see a wonderful picture by Raul Martinez, hand painted with the Cuban flag there. So the flag becomes used again by contemporary artists, but with a sense of irony. So here is a picture by Alfredo Sarabia of, probably at the time that they were painted, the Cuban flag and the Soviet flag crossed there. That was probably something that was about the pride and that union and that alliance. But now with this spider web of electrical wires crisscrossing it and the wall sort of dilapidated, you have to be questioning what that long-term value was. Similarly, this picture by Adrian Fernandez, it's along the Malecon, the seaside esplanade in Havana. It looks like it's some giant billboard, some grand declaration of the revolution facing north towards the US. Is it a challenge to the US? Is it a greeting for people arriving by sea? We don't know. We are only seeing the back of it. In fact, it's not there at all. The clouds, the sea, the street, those are all real. That's analog photography, but the structure was made in the computer using CAD programs. And it becomes a kind of metaphor for the teetering ruins of the Cuban Revolution's grand ambitions. Again, sort of patriotic symbols. It looks like a gleaming medal, like it could be, an Olympic medal. Patria o muerte, declared by Castro, fatherland or death. But it's on literally a 1-cent coin. It's utterly worthless. So this contrast between grand declaration and actual value. Although I confess that our pennies that say "In God We Trust" have the same sort of high and low contradiction there. On the right, picture by Adrian Fernandez, that's taken actually from a stamp. He's just blown up details from stamps from 1962. Now, in 1962, those stamps probably were meant to communicate the idea that the success of the revolution wasn't just the armed soldiers, but also the seamstress, the welder, the farmer, but blown up to a larger scale and isolated. And many years later, it feels kind of ominous, like the welder, the farmer, the seamstress work under the watchful eye of the armed soldier. Immigration is an important theme. Sandra Ramos photographed the passports of people who had left Cuba and then superimposed on the pages the pictures of where they had emigrated to, in this case, Miami. So the key image for our show on the banner, on the cover of our catalog, is this one by Ludmila and Nelson. It's a picture of the Jose Marti monument. If you've been to Havana, you'll know it's on a hill, and I don't know if it's the tallest thing in Havana or not, but it's towering. It's dedicated to Jose Marti, the spiritual leader of the 19th century war for independence. And it's at the Plaza of the Revolution, which would fill up with people. What you're seeing here in the picture on the right is during the Pope's visit in 2012, but often it would be filled with people when Castro would address the crowds. Here's an example of that by Corda. Castro at the base of the Marti Monument, speaking to people gathered in the plaza. So from the aerial view, you can tell, like, if the waves ever came up to the base of the Marti Monument, it means that all of Havana would have been underwater. So what does it mean? Does it mean the state, the country, Cuba, stands strong even when battered by powerful forces? Or does it mean the Cuban state preserves itself even if it means sacrificing all of the people of the country? You could go either way. There's a kind of plausible deniability, which is important because the censors are still there. When I asked Nelson Ramirez whether it was okay to tape to record our conversation when I interviewed him, he said, yeah, we're used to being recorded. There is this sense always of people watching. So I showed you this picture by Corda. It's not in the show, but what's in the show is this picture by Rainier Leva Novo, where he's taken Corda's picture and eliminated Castro. It's from a series called A Happy Day. It was started in the year that Castro died. And it questions, what would Cuba have been like? What would Cuba have been like without Castro? But also, what would Cuba have been like without the photographs that built a cult of personality for people like Castro? That's the question. So the show continues to until August 3rd. I want to tell you a couple of things. There is a catalog, and I think Andra said she had put a link for that. In the exhibition, we have all of our labels are in English and Spanish, and we also have interviews that are accessed with QR codes in the show, but also will be added to our online collection database, where some of the photographers here speak about specific pictures. And finally, we will have a symposium February 15th that will bring 9 of the photographers to Houston, 5 of them from Havana, 4 of them from elsewhere in the US, artists who have immigrated. And it'll be a real chance to hear directly from the artists. So think about coming to Houston. And that's it. And I think I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see you, and Andra can ask questions if I can stop the share.
Hi, I'm back on. Thank you, Malcolm. That was a wonderful talk about everything that you have going on in the exhibition. It really was very complete. Thank you. Does anyone have a question? If you do, please put it into the Q&A section if you're able to figure that out. I know sometimes these Zooms can be a little hard to figure out where to put things. And I don't have a question yet from the panel, but well, actually, I do have a question. What was the most surprising takeaway while you were first beginning the research for this exhibition?
That's a good question. It's hard to think back now. I guess if I think about when we did that small installation in 2017 before we met Madeleine, I can't say I really had much of an understanding of what we were putting on the walls, other than a kind of visual understanding of what pictures I thought were interesting and a certain vague notion of the history. And so that first trip to Havana, just being able to talk to the artists makes such a difference, to know their personal stories, and to have a better understanding of the culture and the history of Cuba, and the personal histories of the artists just made it all so much richer. And that's what we've tried to do in the show, because I think, Cuba's not that far away, but it's it's largely unknown to most Americans. And so I think we've tried to make sure that the historical context is present in our labels, that the voices of the artists are there to be heard, and that the sort of breadth of what's been created there in the last 50 years is visible on the walls.
I have 3 questions all coming in regarding the symposium.
Okay.
And they're one is, when is the event? And I believe you said February 15th.
So it's Saturday, February 15th. It's an all-day symposium. It will be, there'll be simultaneous translation, so that if some of the participants feel more comfortable speaking and listening in Spanish, that's possible, and same for our audience members. There are 3 panels. One is about, I have to remember what we call our 3 panels. But in any case, we've got 9, as I said, 9 of the artists. It is free, with general admission to the museum, open to the public. It will be recorded, and I think eventually we'll get it online, but I think that's a little bit of eventually.
Okay, that was the other question, is will it be virtual and or recorded?
It won't be streamed
okay.
at the time. It will be recorded and then eventually get up online. Where we are certainly interested in making it as widely available as we can.
Okay. And those are the questions that we have so far. I don't know if there are any other questions. I think it's an exciting exhibition. I'm hoping that people can get to Houston. If not, this was a nice way to see what you have going on.
Yeah. Can I just, maybe in one of the final 2 minutes before the hour ends, I just want to just say a word about our institution and our collection. So, I mean, the museum itself is an encyclopedic museum. Photography is half of the collection. We collect from the moment of its invention up to the present day. And we try to collect globally, though we don't have everything covered, but it's wide ranging. We have permanent galleries for the display of our collection. We do special exhibitions you know, with some regularity. And we also have galleries, as I mentioned at the beginning, where photography is in dialogue with works in other media. We also have a study center, so people who are doing research or who just love a particular artist can come and consult the collection by appointment. And also, I'll mention that our entire collection is, that records for our entire collection are online. If you go to mfah.org, you can go to collection or art, I forget exactly what it says. And you can search by artist or other categories. Almost everything has an image associated with the record, but you can see what's here and what's not. And we're really eager for the world to know the amazing collection that Ann Tucker started and built.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing.
that I've continued.
I do have two more questions really quickly
Mhm.
because they've been thrown
Okay.
into the mix. I'm going to ask them both at the same time and then you
Okay.
can answer.
Okay.
One, will the exhibition be traveling anywhere? And two,
No.
do you have any plans to continue working with Cuban artists?
Okay, so no, it's not traveling, but it's up here for like 10 and a half months. So that's giving our community a really great chance to see it and have people come. Yeah, I think as a result of putting this show together, there were a number of works that we bought, realizing that we had our existing collection, we had Madeleine's collection, they came together, but there were other pieces of the story that we wanted to tell. And so we've acquired more work in preparation for the show. I think I've really encouraged Raquel Carrera to, who has been my indispensable partner on the whole project, to work with that group of pictures by Ivan Cañas that she brought in, whether that's another exhibition or whether it's some articles and online features, things like that. But I think because of this show and because of the way the collection's been built, we are now known as, I think, arguably the richest collection of post-revolution Cuban photography anywhere. And so we're the place to come, and we're also, I think that will serve as a kind of magnet to bring more work to the collection, and we certainly are interested in continuing to build.
Think it's just wonderful. I know there's so much to Cuba that we don't get to see and hear about. So bringing it to the US and bringing it to the art world is just really an amazing thing for everyone to get
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
experience.
And I think, one of our hopes for the show is greater mutual understanding. There was great optimism during the Obama years for a rapprochement, and that's disappeared, and I'm afraid things are going to get worse. But we hope that maybe art can at least create a greater understanding between our countries.
I agree. I want to say thank you, Malcolm, on behalf of AIPAD and even myself for doing this talk. I'm really excited about it and I'm glad we got to do it. Thank you all for attending. I hope that we will see you at our next talk. We don't have a date for that yet, but you'll be hearing about it online. And then we hope you'll all visit us at AIPAD in person and come say hello to everybody. Malcolm, I think, will be roaming the halls, the aisles. And yeah, so thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, everyone, for coming on today. And please stay well, stay healthy, stay warm, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.